Hello, this is Michael Paul with the New Orleans Scottish Rite College. I'd like to do a video today on the New Orleans Scottish Rite Craft Lodges. I've done several videos on this already, but I think there's a little bit more that needs to be said. So let's start with a trip into the past. In 1857, 2 years before he was elected Sovereign Grand Commander, Albert Pike was elected to the office of Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana in New Orleans. In his inaugural address, ordered to be printed in the minutes of the Grand Consistory, he said in part, quote, "I see around me the representatives of more than one race, and the disciples of more than one Masonic rite. I rejoice at this reunion, and it gives me happy augury of the prosperity, health, and continuance of Masonry in this valley." End quote. Well, that's an interesting statement. Let's look at it. While it is impossible to get into the mind of someone who's been dead for almost 150 years, we can find several significant elements in what Albert Pike said. First, what does he mean by representatives of more than one race? Is he saying that this meeting in 1857 was not limited to only Caucasian Masons? That could be true, as race was not, at that time, the issue in New Orleans that it became in later years. There were black and racially mixed Masons in New Orleans in the early to mid-1800s, but I'm not entirely sure that this is what he meant. Early New Orleans was French by language and culture. Before Pike could practice law in New Orleans, and that was his reason for going to the city, he needed to prove that he could read and write in French. This was because French was the language of most old New Orleans legal records. The French and Creoles in New Orleans were often referred to as being of the Latin race. Pike could have used the word race to speak of the French and Creoles in the Grand Consistory. Without more context, it's not completely clear what Pike meant by his use of this word. It is, however, the second part of his statement that I especially would like to look at in this lecture. Albert Pike said, "I see around me the disciples of more than one Masonic rite." What did he mean? Certainly Pike did not mean that York Rite Masons, who were not also members of the Scottish Rite, were attending a meeting of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. Pike may have been merely acknowledging that those Masons belonged to both rites, but that does not really make sense when you consider what he next said. Pike said, "I rejoice at this reunion, and it gives me happy augury of the prosperity, health, and continuance of Masonry in this valley." What reunion? There was no conferral of degrees that day. It sounds as if he is saying that there was a rejoining of those who were once separated. Is there some suggestion that for a time members of the Scottish Rite in Louisiana were not allowed to be members of the York Rite, or vice versa? I've seen no evidence to support any such ban. At least, I've seen no evidence of problems at that time with established Masonic rites or rituals above the craft degrees. When speaking of the craft degrees, however, a near-Masonic war existed in Louisiana just 10 years before Pike's speech over the rituals used by New Orleans area craft lodges. The rituals used in these craft lodges was still a very emotional subject in 1857. I believe that Pike's comment had to do with craft masonry and the meeting together once again of Masons belonging to lodges using various craft lodge rituals. From the early days of Freemasonry in Louisiana, and for only a short time following 1850, lodges under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana worked in several craft lodge rituals, or different Masonic rites. Louisiana is a unique situation in U.S. Freemasonry. The city of New Orleans was founded in 1718 by Jean-Baptiste Lamont de Bienville. The earliest known record of Freemasonry in New Orleans is July 16, 1752, when the lodge Perfect Harmony was created. This was a French-style lodge created by Masons arriving in New Orleans from the West Indies. This lodge, and the ones that followed, would have worked in the language of the members and used the Masonic rituals that were commonly available to them. In this case, it would have been French language lodges working in the rituals they brought with them from the West Indies, or France. These early French rituals would evolve into what we have as the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite and the French or modern Rite Craft Rituals. Before Louisiana would become a territory of the United States, it would exist under the jurisdiction of France, Spain, and then again, for a short time, France. Freemasonry in New Orleans, just like the people and culture, was very different from any other area of what would become the United States. It was as if we were a separate and distinct nation with its own customs and practices. The two oldest existing lodges in New Orleans are Perfect Union No. 1, created in 1793, and Etoile Polaire No. 1, created in 1794. Both of these lodges work today in English, but initially they each worked in the French language. Additionally, Perfect Union was known as the oldest York Rite, American Webb Ritual Lodge, and Etoile Polaire as the oldest Scottish Rite, and that would be ancient and accepted Scottish Rite Craft Ritual Lodge. The problem is that neither of their present-day rituals existed in the mid-1790s. They would have worked in older rituals. Another problem is that many of these lodges' early records and documents were lost or destroyed. After years of research, no original rituals attributed to these lodges have turned up. It seems that most likely that they used existing rituals of the old so-called Rite of Perfection or Order of the Royal Secret, or whatever rituals they had available. In 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. The Louisiana Territory was approximately 827,000 square miles and nearly double the physical size of the United States. The jewel of the Louisiana Purchase was the valuable port of New Orleans. Merchants in the U.S. often found it far cheaper and safer to bring their goods down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans. Once in New Orleans, they could ship from the Gulf of Mexico to almost anywhere. Along with merchandise, these riverboats brought visitors, including Masons, to the city of New Orleans. While Freemasonry in Louisiana suffered during the Spanish control of Louisiana, either disappearing or going underground, it flourished as a territory of the United States. While continuing to be French in language and culture, New Orleans welcomed those of different backgrounds. The city became a melting pot of diverse people. Freemasonry was no different. Lodges of foreign languages, rituals, and cultures found a home in the New Orleans Masonic community. But more than craft masonry was welcomed in Louisiana. In 1811, a Grand Consistory of the Scottish Rite was established in New Orleans under the jurisdiction of Alexander de Grasse's 1804 Supreme Council in Kingston, Jamaica. This Grand Consistory has a remarkable and often controversial Masonic history. It changed jurisdictions, nature, and structure numerous times. Masonic historians would make a grave mistake in believing that its history is entirely or accurately understood. The current Valley of New Orleans traces itself, probably but not 100% proven, back to this 1811 body. On April 30th, 1812, Louisiana became the 18th state in the United States of America. Less than 2 months later, on June 20th, 1812, 5 French-speaking New Orleans lodges elected the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. Many of the founding members of the Grand Lodge were also members of this 1811 Grand Consistory of Louisiana. Like the rituals of the early New Orleans lodges, the original rituals of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana have not been identified, but it is known that they were French language rituals, which would likely be the same ones used by the lodges. In time, the older French rituals seem to have fallen out of favor, and the French New Orleans Masons began moving to either the French or modern Rite or the Scottish Rite Craft Rituals. The Grand Lodge operated more along the lines of the European Grand Lodges. The Grand Lodge did not involve itself in what seemed to be lodge-only matters, such as the language of the lodge or the rituals in which the lodge chose to work. As long as it was a valid Masonic ritual that was worked somewhere by a legitimate Masonic body, it was felt acceptable for Louisiana lodges. The city of New Orleans began to grow mainly due to its port and the traffic it brought to the city. Masons coming into the city and desiring to visit local lodges were often startled by the masonry practiced in this French city. Freemasonry in most areas of the U.S. was English-speaking and, for the most part, worked in the Preston-Webb style of ritual. The French language and rituals used by the New Orleans lodges were unfamiliar. The general feeling of the visitors was that they did not like or approve of this type of masonry. The Grand Lodge of Louisiana sought to accommodate their lodges by issuing charters to lodges working in the language and ritual of their choice. Over the years, charters have been given to lodges working in French, English, Spanish, Italian, and German, but the rituals used by the lodges seem to be at the top of the problem list for some English-speaking New Orleans Masons. By the 1830s, hot-blooded disputes over the legitimacy of the various rituals were levied against the French-speaking lodges. In an attempt to clarify and resolve the situation, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana in 1833 officially acknowledged, through charters and concordats, the York Rite, or American Webb, the French or Modern Rite, and the Scottish Rite Craft Rituals. The lodges only needed to inform the Grand Lodge in which ritual they desired to work, and the Grand Lodge would issue them the appropriate charter. The Grand Lodge believed that this would accommodate everyone and settle any perceived legitimacy issues concerning the rituals. The Grand Lodge greatly misread the intentions of the English-speaking Masons. Instead of solving the problems, the English-speaking Masons were infuriated by the 1833 actions of the Grand Lodge. The English-speaking Masons felt that since Louisiana was part of the United States, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana should limit itself to only English-speaking lodges. It also felt that the lodges should only work in the Preston-Webb Ritual. They believed that this was the ritual, or a version of it, used by all the other U.S. lodges. The Grand Lodge put its foot down. It felt that the English-speaking Masons were being unreasonable. The Grand Lodge tried to explain that the city did not have a single language, and many senior Masons knew only French, or another language, and they had worked in the rituals of their lodge for many years. They pointed to many European Grand Lodges, which worked in multiple rituals. But the English-speaking Masons were firm. They felt that any deviation from English-speaking lodges working in the Preston-Webb Ritual in the U.S. was a deviation from regular Freemasonry. Regardless of if the English-speaking Masons were being reasonable or unreasonable, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana could foresee trouble. Once the French-speaking population was the overwhelming majority, that number was, however, whittled down with the influx of a steady stream of English-speaking transplants, including Masons, into New Orleans. This was due to the ease of travel into the city from the Mississippi River. And then things exploded. In 1845, a handful of New Orleans English-speaking Masons, led by New Orleans attorney and Mason John Gedge, petitioned the Grand Lodge of Mississippi for relief. They claimed that the Grand Lodge of Louisiana was not regular, as they issued charters to craft lodges working in the Scottish Rite and French or Modern Rite craft rituals. The years between then and Pike's speech were a devastating 10 or so years for Louisiana Freemasonry. The Grand Lodge of Mississippi moved slowly, but ultimately sided with Gedge and his splinter group, declaring the Grand Lodge of Louisiana irregular and open territory. By early 1848, the Grand Lodge of Mississippi had chartered 7 lodges in and around New Orleans. That same year, these lodges organized themselves into a second Grand Lodge, the Louisiana Grand Lodge of Ancient York Rite Masons, and elected John Gedge as its Grand Master. While no other Grand Lodge, except the Grand Lodge of Mississippi, recognized this new Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana could see serious trouble on the horizon. Freemasonry has always been inclined to mirror the society where it exists. New Orleans was no different. The French style of Freemasonry in the Grand Lodge of Louisiana reflected the French culture of the city. But this French city and Grand Lodge were becoming American. Many French in the Grand Lodge realized that it was only a matter of time before the English-speaking Masons would outnumber the French. Fearing that they would lose everything, they felt that the best path was to negotiate with this new Grand Lodge to see if they could come to terms and possibly merge. By doing this, they felt that they could preserve at least some of the heritage and customs. Negotiations between the two Grand Lodges began, and they did reach an agreement. On January 28, 1850, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana and the Louisiana Grand Lodge settled and merged the two Grand Lodges into one. The 7 lodges created by the Grand Lodge of Mississippi would pass under the jurisdiction of the new Grand Lodge of Louisiana. John Gedge, Grand Master of the irregular Louisiana Grand Lodge, would become Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. For a short time, it seemed that the compromise that had been reached would assure peace in Louisiana Masonry. But then, Gedge instructed all non-York Rite lodges to turn in their charters so that they could receive York Rite charters. Only then did it become clear that the merger that was believed to have taken place was actually a takeover by the Gedge group. The original demands of the English-speaking Masons were being realized. The new Grand Lodge would become English-speaking and work in only the York Rite Preston-Webb Ritual. Charges of trickery were made, and 3 lodges withdrew from the new Grand Lodge. The peace that had been hoped for was dashed. It was an all-out war between the two sides. Louisiana Masonry was in a state of turmoil. The divisions in Freemasonry were so pronounced and hostile that it is not an exaggeration to recognize that the statements advanced from "I'm right and you are wrong" to "I'm good and you're evil." After several years, it seemed to be a hopeless situation. The future of Masonry in Louisiana seemed dim. We can only speculate on what might have happened had the open hostilities continued, but then an event occurred that no one could have predicted. 1853 brought the worst yellow fever epidemic on record in New Orleans, and estimates of around 8,000 New Orleanians died, some a lingering gruesome death from this outbreak. Masonic losses during this time included John Gedge and a large portion of the pro-Gedge Grand Lodge of Louisiana line. The 1853 to 1855 proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana show amazing events and a toll that the yellow fever epidemic took on the city and Louisiana Freemasonry. Both sides lost indispensable members. The fire seems to have been taken out of the resolve of most all Masons to continue the fighting in the Grand Lodge. Negotiations began again, and compromises were made where no one won all that they wished for, nor lost all that they feared. There is little doubt in my mind that the reunion that Pike spoke of as in his 1857 address was the return of the Scottish Rite Craft Masons to Louisiana Masonry. While all new charters would be for York Rite lodges, the historic rituals of the Scottish Rite Craft Lodges were allowed to return to the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. However, the French or modern Rite rituals did not return and may have blended into some of the Scottish Rite Ritual lodges. An uneasy truce was reached, and that brings us to the present. The handful of Scottish Rite lodges that were allowed to exist in the 1850s have evolved into 10 lodges that comprise the 16th district of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. They are the Scottish Rite District. They work in a unique, historic, and proud district of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. Members of these lodges have served the Grand Lodge in all offices, including Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. Many of them have received a 33rd degree of the Southern Jurisdiction, and a number have served as Sovereign Grand Inspectors General of the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction. Anyone who has seen the rituals of these lodges can verify their beauty and highly symbolic nature. So, why are there so few of these lodges in U.S. Masonry? Let's try to examine that question. Following the American Revolution, Freemasonry in the very young United States was set up according to the rules made by the Masons of that time. The Almighty did not create and give these rules to the Masons of the United States. Men created the rules. They made rules that they felt would best serve Freemasonry in this country. Many rules seem, however, arbitrary. They were made up of Masons who were setting up what they felt should be the norm for Freemasonry in a new land. Decisions were often made without deeper reason or meaning than how they wanted their Masonry to work. It was usually only a continuation of what they knew of Freemasonry. The language of Masonry was English, because that was the language of most of the Masons in the new United States. The ritual was a refinement of the ritual used by most U.S. Masons. All was fine, but then the new USA began to grow. When the U.S. obtained the massive Louisiana territory, New Orleans was included. Freemasonry there was not of the same language, ritual, or culture as the rest of the U.S. That presented them with a problem that only grew. The rituals and language of Freemasonry in New Orleans were found unacceptable simply because they were not how things were done in the rest of the U.S. We can find no deeper meaning or reason. There was no thought or consideration for the way things were done in New Orleans. Masonry in New Orleans was different. Different became viewed as improper, unacceptable. Freemasonry in New Orleans needed to change so that it was no longer different. It was a trying time for everyone. The intolerant attitudes evolved into beliefs that any craft ritual that was not the American Webb-style ritual was considered irregular, unmasonic. They were unacceptable for any U.S. craft lodge. But what about the other rituals of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite? Well, the rituals of the Scottish Rite from the 4th to 33rd were felt to be acceptable. The only problem was with the Scottish Rite craft rituals from the 1st to 3rd. The fact that they were all rituals of the same system seemed irrelevant. Masons became fixed in their opinions, and nothing would change their minds. Over time, most U.S. Masons forgot the craft lodges of the Scottish Rite. It was only those who lived in the New Orleans area, or those who visited there and happened to visit one of those strange lodges, who knew that they existed. Even today, with the advent of the internet, many still have little knowledge of the existence of these lodges. The fact that the Scottish Rite Craft Ritual is one of the most popular rituals in regular recognized Freemasonry outside the U.S. is often ignored or unknown. The handful of lodges that work in the Scottish Rite Craft Ritual outside of New Orleans and in the U.S. is very few. For those in the U.S. who are aware of the Scottish Rite Craft Rituals worked in the U.S., we often find curious beliefs. Some disapprove of these lodges for no other reason than they are unacceptable and not regular. That's their opinion, and that's it. When pushed for a reason to justify such a belief, no logical answer can be given. They are simply unacceptable. On the other hand, others almost venerate them and wish that these magnificent lodges could be in all jurisdiction. Some view them as a Camelot, where everything is good, fair, and inspired. For others, the lodges are like Dante's Inferno, where nothing is proper, helpful, or legal. Why do we have such highly contradictory opinions? What is the truth? Anyone who has spent time in New Orleans and visited the 10 lodges of the 16th District know that these lodges are like any other lodges in any other area, except that they use a different ritual. Within these 10 lodges are strong lodges and ones that are almost on life support. Some lodges do excellent ritual work, and some can barely open. Some are well organized, and some are not. They operate like 10 lodges anywhere else in the U.S. The only difference is their ritual. Those who expect to see flames shooting out of the eyes of lodge officers find only normal Masons, ones like they may find in their community, who are trying to do the work of their lodge. The same is true of those who expect to see perfection in every aspect of the lodge operation. They are often disappointed when they find only normal Masons and not enlightened sages. What is found are Masons with the same strengths and weaknesses as in any other lodge. They are not devils or saints. They are just Masons trying to practice Freemasonry as they learned in their lodge. Yes, there is a historical aspect to working the Scottish Rite Craft Lodges in the U.S. Unfortunately, they are looked at disapprovingly by some, yet others greatly admire them. Most U.S. Masons have no opinion at all. The simple fact is that all the degrees of the Scottish Rite, from EA to Sovereign Grand Inspector General, teach profound moral and philosophical lessons. They are all beautiful guides for living. They are all worthy of study. If our goal in the Scottish Rite is to gain light only to gain importance, then we will fail to understand or grow in philosophical enlightenment. To thrive in the Scottish Rite, we must know the Scottish Rite and all its teachings. We must seek light to grow in knowledge and internal worth. There is profound wisdom and valuable lessons in the craft degrees of the Scottish Rite because it was designed to be the foundation of the whole system. No great temple is built with a weak, unacceptable, or irregular foundation. If we wish to claim the Scottish Rite, then we must correctly understand the whole of the Scottish Rite. This would include an appreciation of the value of the craft degrees of that system. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy the videos, please hit the like button and subscribe to us. Please pay a visit to the Cornerstone Book Publishers website at cornerstonepublishers.com for outstanding Masonic education. See you next time.